These days, most people in Western countries seem to be convinced that the United States was the main victor in the Second World War. For anyone from the former Soviet Union, this notion is just a bit off. It's downright jarring. One can't help but wonder if some historical facts have been tucked away all these years since the conflict ended. So let's dive in today and use sources from both home and abroad to figure out who really played the biggest part in winning this monumental struggle. Right then, let's dig a little deeper. Straight after World War II ended, there was a survey in France asking who the main victor was. Most of the French said it was the Soviet Union. Fast forward about 70 years, and when a similar survey was done not just in France, but also in the US, UK and Germany, most people said the United States was the principal victor. Only in the UK did people think differently. They reckon they themselves were the main winners of World War II. We're asking Americans which countries played the biggest role in defeating the Nazis in World War II. Let's have a listen. Who played the main role in defeating the Nazis and suffered the most losses? I could be wrong, but wasn't it the USA? The USA, Britain? And which country's army marched into Berlin? American. Is this a case of missing details in our age of information technology? Unlikely. Take the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, for instance. Blogger Ilya Varlamov visited the museum and made a video about his visit. He describes his futile attempts to find not just an entire pavilion, but even a small stand that highlights the Soviet Union's role in defeating Nazism during World War II. Sure, you could say that the Americans honor their heroes, and indeed our museums don't often feature large displays about the role of Western allies in winning World War II either. But there's more to it. The deliberate downplaying and even omission of the Soviet Union's role in defeating Nazism has long been entrenched in Western media and history textbooks. Take, for example, the Cambridge University Press's history of World War II. In 3 hefty volumes totaling 2,000 pages, events on the Eastern Front get a measly 30 pages. When I popped into Cambridge University's website and had a glance at a summary of Eastern Front events, one phrase struck me, quote, "In a conflict as vast as World War II, no single theater of war can claim to have played a central or definitive role in the outcome." The US, the UK and France recently launched a special medal commemorating the 75th anniversary of the victory over Nazism. This medal proudly displays the flags of 3 nations. But here's the catch. There's no sign of the Soviet Union's flag, nor any mention of it whatsoever. I spent some time living in America, and when I asked my American friends who won World War II, they were absolutely certain. Who else? The United States of America. When I pressed them for reasons, they'd say, well, look, Russia was fighting Germany for 5 years without much success, and when the Americans showed up, the war ended straight away. So today, let's try to get to the bottom of this with 10 straightforward facts. Who was the main victor in World War II? First off, what were the sizes of the German armies and their allies on the Western and Eastern fronts? Here are the figures. As we can see, on the Soviet front, there were between 190 and 270 divisions at various times. Meanwhile, Anglo-American forces faced 56 to 75 divisions on the Western Front in France from June 1944 onwards. As for the Italian front, around 23 to 27 divisions were stationed there during this period. Essentially, in the final year of the war, from June 1944 to May 1945, Hitler deployed an army of 2 to 3 times larger against the Soviet forces than against the Anglo-American troops. Regarding the period from June 1941 to June 1944 on the Western Front in North Africa, in 1941 and 42, and later in Italy, only about 20 to 26 divisions were engaged. On the Eastern Front against the USSR during these years, Germany and its allies fielded 6 to 10 times more divisions.
For
example, there's an English-language resource where anyone can check month by month how many German divisions were on each front. The takeaway from these figures is simple. 2/3 of Wehrmacht divisions were on the Eastern Front, while only a third was spread across the other fronts of World War II combined. However, being stationed somewhere is one thing, actually fighting is another. The fact is, 50 Wehrmacht divisions stationed in France from 1940 to 1944 didn't engage in any military actions. So if we consider the Wehrmacht divisions that saw combat, the ratio would be approximately this. 83% of Wehrmacht divisions were engaged on the Eastern Front, while a mere 17% fought on all other fronts combined. Interestingly, British historian Robert Kershaw wrote in his book titled 1941, "It's important not to overlook the significance of these events, because out of 20 million Wehrmacht soldiers, 17 to 19 million fought in Russia." The Eastern Front stretched anywhere between 2,200 and 6,200 kilometers at various times. In contrast, the Western Front in France, post the Allies' Normandy landings in June 1944, never exceeded 800 kilometers. As for the Western Front in Italy, there was a mere 300 kilometers. To put it another way, the Eastern Front was anywhere from 3 to 7 times longer than its Western counterpart. There was a stark contrast between the commencement of hostilities on the Eastern Front in June 1941 and the Western Front in June 1944. It all boiled down to the forces Germany could muster against the Soviet Union versus those against Britain and America. Let's take a closer look. When Germany and its allies attacked the Soviet Union, their combined forces numbered around 10.5 million soldiers, while the Soviets had about 5.5 million. Essentially, Germany's army and its satellites were nearly twice the size of the Soviet forces. At this juncture, the Soviet Union had no real allies fighting alongside them on active fronts. By June 1944, Germany and its allies still commanded a force of roughly 9.5 to 10 million troops. However, this time, the combined forces of the USA and Britain totaled a whopping 16 million soldiers, giving them an army of 1.5 times larger. Crucially, the USA and Britain had a formidable ally in the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union, which was tying down the bulk of Hitler's forces. So, in June 1944, the Anglo-American troops faced about 1 million German soldiers on the Western Front, including Italy and France. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, there were approximately 4 million Wehrmacht soldiers. This raises an intriguing question. If the USA and Britain were the main victors of World War II, why were they met by only 10% of Hitler's army, around 500,000 soldiers, during their landings, while a hefty 60% of the active German army was battling the Soviet Union? From January 1945 onwards, most Germans fighting on the Western Front weren't focused on stopping the Americans, but rather on how to end the war as swiftly as possible. Here's a quote from the British historian Liddell Hart's book, History of the Second World War. After the Battle of the Ardennes in January 1945, most German commanders weren't thinking about how to halt the Allies' advance, but were puzzled as to why they weren't advancing faster to finally end this loathsome war. It's crucial to grasp that by June 1944, when the USA and Britain opened a second front, the war was already nearing endgame. Germany was practically defeated, and the Soviet Union was charging towards its borders. Today, March the 26th, troops of the Second Ukrainian Front have reached our national border. Today, July the 21st, troops of the Third Baltic Front have stormed and captured the city of Ostrov. On September the 16th, 1944, north of Prague, our troops occupied several settlements. Of course, the most significant sacrifice the defeaters of Nazism made was the lives of their citizens. The combined losses of the USA, Britain and France amounted to 1.5 million souls. The Soviet Union, however, paid a far steeper price, losing about 20 times more lives than those of the Western victors combined. To put it plainly, Soviet casualties stood at around 29 million people. In other words, 1 in every 6 Soviet citizens perished. In Belarus, the situation was even grimmer, with 1 in every 3 inhabitants losing their lives. While France saw 1 in 60 casualties, Britain 1 in 100, and the United States 1 in 300, the devastation in Belarus and the Soviet Union was far greater. There, a staggering 1 in 3 people perished in Belarus, and 1 in 6 across the entire Soviet Union. When it comes to the losses of the USA, Britain and France, they pale not only in comparison to those of the Soviet Union, but even to those of Poland. For instance, Poland's human toll was 10 times greater than that of any of the aforementioned Western states. As for civilian casualties, the figures are simply astounding. The Soviet Union lost 35 times more civilians than the combined total of the USA, Britain and France. That translates to 18 million civilian deaths in the USSR versus 500,000 across 3 Western nations. To put things into perspective, 641,000 residents died of starvation in Leningrad alone. On a single day, the 23rd of August 1942, German air raids claimed 40,000 civilian lives in Stalingrad. By contrast, throughout the entirety of World War II, bombings in all of France resulted in approximately 58,000 civilian deaths. Compared to the United States, the Soviet Union lost roughly 1,500 times more civilians. Yet, despite this shocking disparity, the United States did not see fit to acknowledge the Soviet Union's role in the medal commemorating the 75th anniversary of victory over Nazis.
What about our role as liberators?
You have no role as liberators.
World War II? You lost your father in World War II.
You got into World War II because
Come
it's
on.
Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor.
I would argue we were always going to get in, and that pushed us in. But thank God the United States got in, right?
Thank God the Russians had already won the bloody war almost by then. Don't forget, 23 million Russians died protecting you and me from the Nazi menace.
When discussing the material losses of the Soviet Union, we could go on forever. To give you an idea, around 1,710 cities were destroyed, 700,000 villages wiped out, and 32,000 industrial enterprises obliterated. 6 million buildings were beyond repair, leaving 25 million people homeless.
5 миллионов человек лишилось крова.
To grasp what Nazi Germany plundered and carried off from the Soviet Union, consider this. If you lined up the wagons filled with goods forcibly taken by Germany from former Soviet territories, you'd have a train circling in the entire globe, a convoy of around 1.5 million wagons. The Soviet Union took a massive hit, losing a third of its national wealth. In contrast, France and the UK saw relatively minor losses, clocking in at 0.8% and 1.5% respectively. Meanwhile, the United States turned a tidy profit during World War II, raking in a cool $117 billion. Now, in Britain, they have a slightly different take on the material losses of the victorious nations. For instance, a quote from the esteemed Whitaker's Almanac of 1946 states, "Britain spent more than any other ally during the war in proportion to its national income." That may well be true, but the fact remains that what Britain spent stayed within Britain, whereas the Soviet Union's material losses were irretrievable. Some might argue that China's losses during World War II were far greater than those of the US, UK, or France. However, China doesn't claim the leading role in defeating the Nazi bloc. All right then, let's move on to the next point. According to a comprehensive 12-volume encyclopedia of World War II, an overwhelming 75%, 3 out of 4 of German divisions were decimated on the Eastern Front. The Germans also lost 3/4 of their tanks, artillery and aircraft there. On all other fronts combined, Germany lost only 1/4 of its military hardware and personnel. Western sources back this up too. A recent study by German expert Overmans in his book German Military Losses in World War II reveals that from the start of the war until early 1945, German irreversible losses on the Eastern Front were 3 times greater than all other fronts combined. Take another example. Former Wehrmacht General Müller-Hallebrad's book, Germany's Land Army, asserts that by 1945, German irrecoverable losses on the Eastern Front were 4 times higher than on the Western fronts where the Anglo-American forces fought, in Italy, France and Africa. Interestingly enough, the British published data from the so-called Flensburg archives in the authoritative Whitaker's Almanac back in 1946. According to these archives, German losses in the Eastern Front up to 1945 were 3 times greater than across all other theaters of war combined. So no matter which source you consult, they all tell the same story. Germany's principal losses were on the Eastern Front. The most significant battle involving the United States was the Battle of the Ardennes, which took place from December 1944 to January 1945. The Ardennes is an area in the southwest of modern-day Belgium. On the Eastern Front, the defining battle was the Battle of Stalingrad, which raged from approximately September 1942 to January 1943. The losses suffered by the Nazis in the Battle of the Ardennes were around 125,000, while in the Battle of Stalingrad they were a tremendous 1.5 million soldiers. The numbers are simply worlds apart, as are the losses in equipment. For example, the losses in aircraft at Stalingrad were roughly 3 times greater than those in the Ardennes, and when it comes to artillery and tanks, the losses were a jaw-dropping 35 times higher. Now let's talk about our British mates, who are quite convinced that their country played the starring role in defeating fascism. They consider the Battle of El Alamein, which took place in October-November 1942 in Egypt, as their crowning glory. As Winston Churchill famously quipped, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." But let's circle back to our comparison with the Battle of Stalingrad. In Stalingrad, the Germans lost 50 times more soldiers, 16 times more tanks, 64 times more aircraft, and a whopping 67 times more artillery pieces. Yet Western historians often turn a blind eye to these figures in their academic works. Take, for example, what former Wehrmacht General Kurt von Topperskich wrote in his book History of World War II. Although in the overall context of the war, events in North Africa are given more prominence than the Battle of Stalingrad, the catastrophe at Stalingrad had a far greater impact on the German army and people. It was an unimaginable disaster, not experienced since 1806, the annihilation of an army encircled by the enemy. Soldiers! The Special Forces proved themselves true heroes in the fierce but glorious battles of El Alamein. You were chosen because you are the best. Now you face new challenges. There are only 62 of us left. We arrived here as 400. Gentlemen, where's the front line? In the German rear on the Eastern Front, there were up to 6,200 partisan detachments with a combined strength of about 1 million people. Partisans and underground fighters on this front managed to kill, wound or capture around 1 million occupiers and collaborators. They also knocked out 4,000 tanks and armored vehicles, destroyed more than 50,000 trucks, caused over 20,000 train derailments, and rendered 110,000 wagons unusable. From 1942 onwards, the Germans had to pull about 10% of their army from the Eastern Front, roughly 20 to 25 divisions, to deal with partisans and carry out punitive operations against civilians. As for the resistance movement in France, pinning down specific numbers, like how much equipment was destroyed during the German occupation, is nearly impossible. While in Western occupied territories, destroyed equipment was counted in the hundreds, in the East it was counted in the hundreds of thousands. In the entire saga of World War II, fewer French lives were lost in the French resistance than in the ranks of Hitler's army. To put it in numbers, about 20,000 French perished fighting in the resistance, while 50,000 met their end in the ranks of Hitler's forces. You see, the very ideology of Nazism had a completely different approach towards populations in the West compared to those in the East. In occupied France, all German officers were instructed to behave politely with the civilian population. However, it was a whole different ballgame in the East. Take, for example, an order from the German High Commander Keitel on suppressing resistance in occupied territories. One must bear in mind that human life in these countries is worthless, and a deterrent effect can only be achieved through extraordinary brutality. Here's a snapshot of German soldiers taken in the Bryansk region in October 1941. Chalked up on the school blackboard in German is, "A Russian must die so that I must live." For example, any civilian caught after dark at any city in Belarus without a valid reason was immediately shot. The number of people killed in Belarus alone totals 440,000. And we are not talking about concentration camps here, but rather about punitive operations that lasted from a single day to a week. Germany is Kulturland, a land of culture. For comparison, such incidents in the West were isolated, with the number of victims amounting to hundreds. In similar punitive operations in the East, it wasn't just hundreds, but hundreds of thousands who perished, not only in Belarus, but also in Ukraine and Russia. Incidentally, the Germans were well aware that no mercy awaited them in the East after World War II ended, so they were desperate to surrender to the Anglo-American army during the last year or even the final weeks of the war. For instance, in the last week of April 1945 alone, about 3.5 million German soldiers surrendered to the Anglo-American forces. To put that into perspective, this was more than those who surrendered to the entire Soviet Union over all 4 years of war. The surrender of one Nazi criminal, Hermann Göring, is depicted in an American film called Nuremberg, with emotions more akin to an escape from captivity than a surrender. Reichsmarschall Göring, my wife, my daughter, your 8th Air Force destroyed my magnificent Luftwaffe and razed our beautiful cities, but I'd still rather surrender to an aviator.
Gentlemen.
Господа,
May I?
позвольте.
The key distinction between the war in the West and the East lay in the very spirit of resistance. Take, for example, what German soldiers wrote about the level of resistance on the Eastern Front compared to that on the Western Front. Here's a snippet from the British historian Robert Kershaw's book, Birch Crosses Instead of Iron Ones. The behavior of the Russians, even in their first battles, was strikingly different from that of the Poles and Allies who were defeated on the Western Front. Even when encircled, the Russians staunchly defended themselves. And another quote from a German tank ace who fought on both fronts. In the last few days of fighting in the West, we had already come to understand that 5 Russians posed a greater threat than 30 Americans. People stood their ground to the bitter end. Take the Brest Fortress, for example. It held out for an entire month, longer than Denmark, Holland, and Belgium. The Monzund Island in Estonia resisted for 6 weeks, as long as all of France. And then there's the famous Pavlov's house, which held out for 8 weeks, longer than all of France. Mind you, Pavlov's house was a smack dab in the epicenter of military action, with about 1 million soldiers from each side slugging it out. This is us calling. Give us fire support. The Germans are storming the house. During the siege of Sevastopol, Nazi Germany lost around 300,000 soldiers and officers. That's more than they lost conquering Belgium, Denmark, Holland and France combined, plus fighting in the Atlantic and North Africa. We must also mention the famous Nevsky Petachok, a tiny piece of land just 1,000 meters by 500 meters near Nevskaya Dubrovka outside Petersburg. Here, for nearly a year, the Soviet army fought tooth and nail to break the blockade of Leningrad. Estimates suggest that between 50,000 and 200,000 people perished in this small patch of land. It's probably clear who made the main contribution to victory from these facts. As for why one country bore the brunt of the war, while former Allied nations either remain unaware or prefer not to dwell on it, well, that's something for us to think about.